In this chapter, we're going to look at sociology of physical activity, which focuses on the shared beliefs and social practices that constitute specific forms of physical activity like sport and exercise. Sociology information adds to the breadth of knowledge of a well-educated kinesiologist. Our objectives in sociology of physical activity include explaining what a sociologist of physical activity does, identifying the goals of sociology, discussing the origins of sociology of physical activity, explaining how research is conducted in sociology of physical activity, examining what research tells us about inequitable power relations relevant to physical activity, especially gender relations, ethnic and racial relations, and socioeconomic relations. The goals of sociology of physical activity include looking at physical activity with a penetrating gaze that goes beyond our common understanding of social life, identifying and analyzing patterns of change and stability in physical activity, and critiquing physical activity programs in order to identify problems and recommend changes to enhance equality and human well-being. So why do we use sociology in physical activity? It allows us to look more closely at social arrangements that underlie physical activity. It helps us gain insight about ourselves and our culture, and it gives us intellectual tools that we can develop in order to look beyond the physical in human physical activity. So what does a sociologist of physical activity do? Three general areas are teaching, research, and service. If you're going to look at sociology within the frame of the field of kinesiology, sociology plays a really large part in the field of sport management and research in sport management. I recently went to a national sport management conference, and every research presentation had a sociological element within it. One example would be that currently the LPGA Tour is dominated by primarily athletes of Asian ethnicity. So the research looked at how this affects merchandising. Pertaining to service, one group presented on research on opening a velodrome, which is a banked cycling track like the ones you would see in the Olympics. And they looked at whether or not taking large groups of school students to the velodrome increased their physical activity and increased their interest in going to the velodrome and cycling, including students with disabilities. Looking at history of the field of sociology and physical activity, it's a pretty young discipline. The International Committee of Sociology of Sport was founded in 1964, the International Review of Sociology of Sport in 1966, and the Journal of Sport and Social Issues in 1977. The North American Society of Sociology of Sport was formed in 1978, and the Sociology Sport Journal in 1984. Since the mid-70s to present, there's been a big expansion of the subdiscipline, primarily looking at socioeconomic, gender, racial, and ethnic inequalities. Other areas of study have included global, national, and local relations in sport, exercise, and societal conceptions of human bodies, disabilities and abilities, and obesity. Looking at the research methods used in sociology of physical activity, the first one is survey research, which involves using questionnaires. They are completed directly by respondents or filled out by the researcher during a brief, highly structured interview. Questionnaires are used to collect data from a large sample of groups. So an example would be like the US Census. Interviewing is another method where researchers use interviews when they want to broader and deeper information than they can get from a questionnaire, or when they want information about activities that would be difficult or impossible to observe themselves. Because interviews are time-consuming, researchers often focus on smaller groups of people like a focus group. We also have thematic analysis, sometimes called content analysis. This procedure involves examining the material and then categorizing the content in various ways. For example, magazine photos of female and male Olympic athletes, or analyzing categories of physical appearances, position of the body, or emotional displays. With ethnography, Researchers may spend many months or even years observing in a particular social setting. They hang around while ordinary day-to-day events take place, observing or taking part, and keeping careful field notes so they can remember details. With societal analysis, the researcher's goal is to examine the sweep of social life, usually within the perspective of a broad social theory, something like communism or capitalism. Research in sociology of physical activity involves collecting quantitative and qualitative data with a variety of methodologies. Looking at an overview of knowledge in sociology, key topics include power relationships, gender relationships, sexuality in sports, participation patterns, leadership roles, cultural differences, ethnic and racial relations, sport and politics, mass media and sport. Looking at power and power relationships, power is the ability to do what you want without being stopped. And who doesn't like that? But power is basically what underlies all social inequities. So if somebody has too much power and somebody not enough power, that's where we have problems. And power relations affect the quality of life and chances for a better life. When we look at sports stories, the majority of the stories are almost always about power and those in power. Important aspects to consider with power include how power affects participation, leadership, and cultural expression. Gender relations is another big issue in sociology of sport. Gender is distinct from sex. Gender is a set of norms or expectations about how we should behave that are linked to societal understandings of sexuality and procreation. In the U.S. society, men typically hold more power in gender hierarchy, although the relationship can change. If you're looking at sport on television, the rate is something along the lines of 89% of all television sport is male-based. Continuing looking at gender relations in physical activity, one area we look at is participation. Title IX legislation had a large effect on participation. The legislation called for equal opportunity in education for women and girls, and it had a very large effect on athletics because it called for equal opportunity in that area as well. We continue to have societal perceptions of gender-appropriate physical activity. Often people look at really aggressive sport, perhaps lacrosse, and think it is too aggressive for females. Perception is that girls should be participating in ballet and tennis. Another area of study for gender is leadership. There has been a decrease in the percentage of women coaching girls and women's teams, and the reason for the decrease is more and more men in the applicant pool, which leads to salary inequities. Looking at cultural expression and gender in sports, sport is often seen as a heterosexual symbol of manhood. This, as we have seen in recent years, has made many turn a blind eye against violence in sport and athletes, including violence against women. Looking at racial and ethnic relations, an ethnic group is a group of people who share important and distinct cultural traditions. Race is a group of people who are defined by society as different from others on the basis of genetically and inherited traits, traits that we select. It is not a natural or biological category or difference. African Americans have an overrepresentation among athletes in male team sports. Looking at the NFL, about 70% of players are African American, whereas in America in general, African Americans represent about 33% of the population. Looking at access to facilities and coaching, the socioeconomics of minority neighborhoods generally does not lead to everyone having a fair chance of equal access to facilities and coaching opportunities. Looking at this figure, we're looking at two things, both participation in sports and also sports staffing and employment, and what we would consider some power positions. On each of these, you can see the long blue bar refers to white ethnicity, the gray bar is African American, yellow Latina, and red is Asian. Purple is women. The first two categories here are NCAA staff and conference commissioners. We do see some women in these categories, but ethnic diversity isn't too strong. We have a little better diversity in participation, and then interestingly, we look at women's athletic directors and coaches and does not show any women. So we certainly have race and gender diversity problems when it comes to sports and athletics. Looking at leadership when it comes to racial and ethnic relations, there's a very low proportion of African American coaches at the elite level, especially relative to the number of players. There are a few reasons for this. One is racial stereotypes, and the other is basically what we call old boy networks. With old boy networks, think about who owns all the teams and who are the commissioners in sport. They are primarily all older white men. So when employment revolves around that network, we're going to have inequities seen within racial diversity. Moving on to expression, we have the idea of what we call cool pose. It refers to things like end zone dances and the persona of athletes on the field. Another issue is the deception of African American boys concerning the likelihood of becoming a professional athlete. So before we talked about the ratio of African Americans in sports versus American society. As a young child, an African American boy, you're looking at your TV watching NFL on Sunday and might think, oh, well, everybody I see on my screen is African American. I can totally do this. Or maybe even, is this what I'm supposed to do? Whereas the percentage chance of becoming a professional athlete is very, very low. Media portrayals in sport often raise racial connotations of brains versus brawn. There's often a big divide in who's playing what position and how we look at the racial identity and stereotypes of each. Looking at socioeconomic relations, socioeconomic status is social position based on wealth, education, and occupational prestige. Social categories of race, class, and gender operate not independently, but interdependently. Relating to participation, types and amounts of physical activity among people at different socioeconomic levels often differ. You don't see poor people sailing, playing golf, or fencing, and you don't have people from a wealthy background becoming a boxer. As we discussed before, the likelihood of becoming a professional athlete is very slim, but privileged in society are often prepared for alternatives. With socioeconomic relations and leadership, again we see that people who control elite sports are very wealthy and influential leaders. Less affluent people have opportunities for leadership, but it's often in more grassroots sports. So you're going to see different leaders in things like X Games or skateboarding. Looking at cultural expression in socioeconomics, we tend to hold people in higher esteem when we think about expensive sports and having a healthy athletic body. Sport expresses messages about the importance of winning, discipline, obedience, and hard work, suggesting that the rich and poor both deserve whatever wealth they have. Reflecting now on sociology and physical activity in sport, what inequalities have you noticed in sport and physical activity? Going forward as a kinesiologist in the field, how can these be changed to enhance the quality and overall human well-being? These are the problems that we need to solve.